The courthouse clock showed 8:42 a.m. when Kendrick Robinson stepped out of his car. He thought it would be a simple morning, just a routine tax hearing for his grandmother's old house, the place where he grew up, the place that meant everything to him. Dressed in a navy suit, his folder of documents tucked under his arm, he walked in calm but focused. Inside, people shuffled nervously with tickets and papers. Then came his name. The judge's voice cut through the air like a knife. "You're late," the judge said coldly. A fine of $750 dropped on him without warning. Others had slipped in late, but only Kendrick was punished. The room went silent. Eyes turned toward him. In that moment, a simple tax case turned into something far greater, a fight for dignity and fairness inside the very halls of justice. The weeks that followed felt like a storm breaking open. What had started as one unfair fine quickly became something larger, something that reached far beyond Kendrick's own case. His report set off an official inquiry, and soon the courthouse buzzed with investigators, journalists, and whispers in every corner. The evidence piled up fast. Years of records revealed the truth Kendrick had suspected. Black defendants had been fined far more often and far more harshly than others for the same offenses. The numbers were undeniable, but it wasn't just the data. It was the human stories that gave the evidence its weight. A mother remembered being fined hundreds of dollars for a parking violation, even though she had shown proof of a mistake. A young man described how the judge cut him off mid-sentence, never letting him explain, while others were given all the time they needed. Each story added another piece to the picture, and together they told a truth the community could no longer ignore. The news spread quickly. Headlines appeared not just in Greenville but across the state. People gathered outside the courthouse with signs calling for justice and change. Social media carried the story to places Kendrick had never imagined. His phone filled with messages from strangers, some offering support, others sharing their own experiences of unfairness in courtrooms far away. Inside, the pressure grew heavy. Judge Whitman, who had once spoken with such authority, now found himself under investigation and public scrutiny. Staff members who had worked with him for years began to speak up. The court clerk, who had quietly kept her notebook of incidents, came forward, her notes now powerful evidence. Even the longtime bailiff, who had seen it all from the side of the room, admitted he had witnessed the same patterns for years. Their voices gave the investigation strength. And slowly a wall of silence that had stood for decades began to crack. Finally, the judge resigned. His statement was brief, almost cold, but his departure was a turning point. For Kendrick, it wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring no one else would walk into that courtroom and feel what he felt that morning. Singled out, humiliated, dismissed. But resignation was not the end. Real change began when reforms were put in place. Court staff and judges across the state were required to attend training on bias and fairness. Oversight committees were formed to review court decisions, making sure justice wasn't just a word written on the wall but a practice lived every day. Kendrick watched these changes unfold with cautious hope. He knew reform was slow and resistance was real. Some judges bristled at the oversight, claiming their authority was under attack. But the results spoke for themselves. Within months, the data showed fines were more consistent, treatment of defendants more balanced, and people reported feeling respected, even when outcomes didn't go in their favor. Outside the legal system, the ripple effects grew. Law students started clinics focused on civil rights. Community groups formed networks to help defendants understand their rights. In classrooms, professors used Kendrick's story as a case study on the power of speaking up against injustice. For Kendrick, the most meaningful moments came from the people. An elderly man who had sat in the courtroom that day found him months later and said, "I've been coming here for 40 years. I've seen so much unfairness, but I never thought I'd see the day someone stood up and said enough." Another letter arrived from a young public defender in another state. She wrote that his courage had reminded her why she became a lawyer in the first place. 3 months after that morning, Kendrick returned to the courthouse not for a hearing but for something entirely different. He had been invited to speak at the unveiling of a new judicial ethics center. The beige walls had been repainted, the lobby updated, and a small plaque hung at the entrance with words etched in bold letters, "Equal justice is everyone's right." Standing at the podium, Kendrick looked out at the crowd, judges, lawyers, students, and community members all gathered together. He spoke not as a prosecutor, not even as the man who had once been fined unfairly, but as someone who believed deeply in the promise of justice. "Justice isn't only about laws," he said, his voice steady. "It's about people. It's about dignity, respect, and fairness, and it's about making sure that every single person who steps into a courtroom knows they matter." The room erupted in applause, but Kendrick's eyes lingered on the faces in the crowd. Some showed relief, others determination. What he saw most of all was hope, the kind of hope that comes when one voice sparks many others. As he stepped down from the podium, Kendrick knew the work was far from finished. But he also knew something else. Change had begun, and this time it wasn't going to be silenced. The courthouse had its own rhythm that morning. People shuffled in and out, carrying papers, tickets, and the heavy weight of small but stressful problems. The air smelled faintly of old paper and stale coffee. It was the kind of place where most people just wanted to get in, handle their business, and leave as quickly as possible. Kendrick found a seat near the back, quietly reviewing his folder. Inside were neatly stacked documents, tax records, photographs, and notes that proved the mistake in his grandmother's property assessment. This wasn't supposed to be a difficult case. He had the evidence, he had the facts, and he was ready. Then the judge walked in, tall, silver-haired, sharp-eyed. The room immediately fell into silence as if someone had cut the air itself. He carried himself like a man who expected obedience without question. The bailiff called for everyone to rise, and when the judge sat, the entire room followed his lead. Case after case moved quickly. A man in a wrinkled blazer strolled in late, sliding into a seat unnoticed. A young woman in casual clothes slipped into the front row, her phone glowing in her hand. No one said a word. No raised eyebrows. No reprimands, Kendrick noticed. His instincts told him to. Years as a prosecutor had taught him to pay attention to details others ignored. But he stayed focused. His time would come soon. When his name was finally called, Kendrick rose and walked steadily to the podium. He projected calm, even as he adjusted his tie and opened his folder. But before he could speak, the judge's voice thundered across the room. "You're late, Mr. Robinson." The words hit with a force that seemed heavier than the moment called for. Kendrick straightened, his voice respectful. "Your Honor, I apologize. I was delayed by urgent federal matters." The judge cut him off sharply. "Excuses do not excuse tardiness. This court runs on order. If you can't respect that, perhaps you should reevaluate your priorities." The room grew still. All eyes turned toward Kendrick. He felt the weight of the stairs, not with fear, but with a steady awareness. He had seen this before. Authority used not as a tool of justice, but as a weapon of humiliation. Then came the gavel. "You are fined $750 for contempt." Gasps rippled quietly across the courtroom. A fine that steep for something so small? Kendrick's jaw tightened, but his expression remained controlled. Around him, people exchanged glances. Some looked shocked, others uncomfortable. A few lowered their eyes as if they had seen this happen before and didn't dare to react. Kendrick raised a hand slightly, calm but firm. "Your Honor, may I explain?" The gavel came down again. "You may not. Consider this a lesson in respect." The words were final, heavy, and laced with something more than just frustration about time. Kendrick returned to his seat, his mind racing. He thought about the man in the wrinkled blazer, the young woman scrolling on her phone, both of them late and untouched by the judge's scorn. The difference was glaring, undeniable. He opened his folder again, but not just to glance at the tax documents. Instead, he began to write. Notes, observations, comparisons. Every detail mattered now. This was no longer just about property taxes. In that small courtroom filled with nervous defendants and anxious families, something larger than a fine had just taken shape. Kendrick realized the judge hadn't simply punished lateness. He had revealed a pattern, one that had gone unchecked for years. And Kendrick wasn't about to let it pass unnoticed. The cases continued around him, but his focus was elsewhere. The unfairness burned quietly in his chest, not as anger but as resolve. The fine was steep, the treatment humiliating, but the truth was clearer than ever. This wasn't just about him. It was about a system, and he had just stepped into the middle of it. When Kendrick's name was called a second time, the tension in the room shifted. He stood slowly, his folder pressed against his chest, and walked back to the podium with measured steps. The gavel had already struck him once that morning, and the weight of that fine still hung heavy in the air. But Kendrick wasn't the type to bow his head and retreat quietly. He set his folder on the stand and began. Your Honor, I have here the documentation regarding the property tax adjustment. The property has been in my family for decades, and the numbers in the city's records do not align with the true assessed value. He opened the folder, revealing page after page of neat documents, charts, and photographs. Each page was carefully placed, each fact ready to speak for itself. Kendrick's voice was calm but steady. This shows the original assessment, which remained consistent for 5 years. The new adjustment reflects a sudden 30% increase without notice or explanation. But Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, uninterested. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room more than the papers. I'll review it in due time, he said, his tone laced with dismissal. But first, let's not forget the matter of your tardiness. Do you truly believe that your federal responsibilities, however noble, allow you to ignore the rules of this court? The words struck the room like cold steel. Some spectators lowered their gaze, uncomfortable with the growing edge in the judge's voice. Others leaned forward, sensing something unusual was unfolding. Kendrick inhaled slowly, holding the weight of the silence. Then, in a voice that carried calm conviction, he answered, Your Honor, I mean no disrespect. But I must ask, are these rules applied equally to everyone in this courtroom? The room froze. The question hung in the air, cutting deeper than any document or fine. A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. People exchanged glances, whispering quietly behind their hands. The law student in the back stopped writing mid-sentence, her pen hovering above the page. The judge stiffened, his face reddening. Are you questioning the integrity of this court, Mr. Robinson? I'm asking for clarity, Kendrick replied evenly. His eyes never left the judge's. His voice was steady, almost too calm for the storm it was stirring. Fairness matters not only for me, but for everyone who stands before this bench. The gavel slammed down again, sharp and angry. I will not tolerate accusations in my courtroom. Your fine stands. The words echoed against the walls. But Kendrick didn't flinch. He inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and walked back to his seat. The silence in the courtroom wasn't just silence, it was charged. Heavy. Everyone felt it. An older man 2 rows ahead glanced back at him with quiet respect. The clerk at her desk hesitated in her typing, her eyes flicking toward Kendrick, betraying her discomfort. Even the bailiff shifted slightly, as though the balance of power in the room had been shaken. Kendrick sat down, his pen already moving across his notebook. He wasn't just writing about his case anymore. He was documenting something larger, every detail, every inconsistency. Every glance that proved what was happening here wasn't just about being late. The judge carried on with the next case, his tone crisp as if nothing had happened. But the courtroom wasn't the same. The energy had changed. A single question had broken through the surface, exposing something deeper. Kendrick knew it in his bones. This was no ordinary morning. And from that moment on, it wasn't only his grandmother's house he was fighting for. It was something far greater, justice itself. The courtroom had returned to its steady rhythm, one case after another. The judge's voice clipped and mechanical, the shuffle of papers filling the pauses. But Kendrick wasn't listening anymore. He sat in the back row, his notes filling page after page, his mind sharper with every stroke of the pen. The fine still stung, not because of the money, but because of what it represented. The double standard was clear. He had seen others slip in late without so much as a glance from the bench. Yet he had been singled out, humiliated, and punished in full view of the room. It was never about being late. It was about something deeper. As the last of the morning cases wound down, Kendrick rose from his seat. His steps were calm, deliberate, each one echoing across the worn wooden floor. People still in the room looked up, curious. The judge, now flipping through paperwork, didn't immediately notice. But the clerk did. Her fingers paused above her keyboard, eyes flicking toward him. Kendrick stopped at the podium again, this time not with his folder of documents, but with something far more powerful. From his briefcase, he pulled out a badge, its golden emblem catching the light that filtered in through the tall courtroom windows. The shine was unmistakable. Your Honor, Kendrick said, his voice clear and respectful. I believe I should properly introduce myself. The judge finally looked up, his eyes narrowed, annoyance flashing across his face. The court session has concluded, Mr. Robinson. If you have further business, schedule it through the clerk. But Kendrick didn't flinch. He held his badge higher, making sure not only the judge but everyone present could see. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. A ripple of whispers stirred through the quiet room. "I am Kendrick Robinson," he continued, his tone calm but carrying weight. "Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District of South Carolina. I've served in the Department of Justice for over a decade, prosecuting cases involving human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights." The words hit like a gavel of their own. The judge froze, his papers forgotten. The color in his face drained, his fingers stiff against the desk. Around the room, eyes widened. The law student in the corner scribbled furiously, her hand shaking with excitement. The clerk's lips parted as though she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Kendrick kept going, his voice firm yet measured. "This morning I was delayed by urgent matters connected to a federal case. I understand the importance of rules, Your Honor. I live by them every single day. But what I witnessed in this courtroom was not rules applied equally. Others arrived late and were ignored. I was singled out, fined, and silenced. That is not justice." The judge shifted in his chair, gripping the arms as if the wood itself could steady him. "Mr. Robinson, if you feel there was a procedural issue, you are welcome to file a complaint through the proper channels." His voice was quieter now. Stripped of its earlier confidence, Kendrick lifted his notebook. Pages filled with observations, times, and details. "I've already begun documenting everything. Not only my treatment, but the treatment of others in this courtroom. As an officer of the court, I am obligated to report any patterns of bias or discrimination I encounter. And I will." The silence in the room grew heavy, almost suffocating. The bailiff looked down. The clerk swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly. Even the judge, a man used to commanding obedience, seemed unsettled. His eyes darted briefly toward the handful of spectators still lingering, as though realizing that witnesses now held a truth he could not erase. "Mr. Robinson," the judge said finally, his voice strained, "this court takes such matters seriously, but now is not the time." "With respect, Your Honor," Kendrick interrupted gently, "now is exactly the time. Because justice is not only about verdicts and fines, it is about how we treat people in this room, whether they are a law student, a clerk, or a defendant with no resources. Fairness must be seen. It must be lived. And this morning that did not happen." For the first time, Judge Whitman had no response. His lips pressed into a thin line, his hands still on the arms of his chair. The power he usually commanded so effortlessly now seemed to waver in the air. Kendrick lowered his badge, slid it back into his case, and picked up his papers. He looked at the judge one final time and said, "Thank you, Your Honor. I'll ensure this is addressed properly." He turned and walked toward the door. Behind him, the silence was louder than any word spoken. Every eye followed him. Some were wide with admiration, others with shock, but all of them knew they had witnessed something rare. An ordinary morning turned into a reckoning. The door closed behind Kendrick, but the impact of his revelation remained, echoing long after his footsteps faded from the hallway. When Kendrick walked out of that courtroom, the story could have ended there. He could have paid the fine, shaken off the humiliation, and gone on with his day. But deep inside, he knew this was bigger than one morning. What he had witnessed was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern, and patterns demand proof. That evening, Kendrick sat at his desk with his notes spread out before him. Every observation from the courtroom was written down. Times, names, the exact wording the judge used. He opened his laptop and began drafting a formal report for his office. His words were precise, his tone calm, but the weight behind them was undeniable. He wasn't just writing about a tax case anymore. He was documenting bias. The next morning, his supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's Office called. "Kendrick, I read your report. If what you're saying is true, this isn't just one bad ruling. This could be systemic." Her voice carried urgency. She encouraged him to gather more information, to document as much as possible. "We'll take it forward," she said. Word began to spread quietly in Greenville. A young law student who had been in the room that day wrote about what she saw in a long social media post. She described how the judge ignored late arrivals from others but came down harshly on Kendrick. The post gained attention quickly, shared hundreds of times, sparking outrage and curiosity. Soon others began commenting with their own stories. That was when the pieces started falling into place. A court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, reached out nervously. For years, she had kept a small notebook hidden in her desk, filled with entries about moments that had felt off. Dates, names, and unfair rulings scribbled in her careful handwriting. She had been too afraid to speak up before, but Kendrick's stand gave her courage. She handed over the notebook, her hands trembling. "I couldn't stay silent anymore," she whispered. Then came James Wilson, the longtime bailiff, a man who had stood in that courtroom for over 15 years. He spoke in a low, steady voice. "I've seen it too. Different treatment, depending on who stood before the bench. I knew it wasn't right, but I thought nothing could change." His words carried the weight of years of silence finally breaking. Bit by bit, the truth built momentum. Stories surfaced from people across the community. A young woman recounted being fined hundreds for a parking mistake, while another man with multiple violations paid only a small fee. A father spoke of being interrupted and shamed in front of his children, while others were treated with respect. What had started as Kendrick's personal humiliation now echoed as a collective truth. Soon, the Judicial Review Commission launched an inquiry. Investigators requested years of case records from Judge Whitman's courtroom. They interviewed staff, reviewed files, and compared outcomes. Patterns began to emerge, clear, undeniable, and deeply troubling. And outside the courthouse, people began to act. Small gatherings turned into larger rallies. Signs appeared. "Justice should be blind." "End courtroom bias." Local reporters picked up the story, then state newspapers, then national media. Kendrick's name surfaced again and again, not as a victim, but as the prosecutor who dared to speak up. Kendrick, however, stayed focused. He avoided the noise of headlines and protests, instead pouring his energy into documentation. Every detail mattered. Every voice that came forward became part of a larger picture. By the end of the week, it was no longer just about a fine. It was about trust. Could people trust the courts to be fair? Could they believe in justice when it looked so different depending on the person standing at the podium? In quiet moments, Kendrick thought of his grandmother's house, the place that had brought him to court in the first place, the home where he learned right from wrong under her watchful eye. She had taught him that silence in the face of injustice was never an option. And now he understood why this fight mattered so deeply. Seeds had been planted, whispers had turned into voices, and voices were becoming a movement. What began as one judge's unfair ruling was now unfolding into something the entire community, and soon the entire country, would have to face. The inquiry moved quickly. What began as quiet questions behind closed doors soon grew into something impossible to contain. Investigators arrived at the courthouse with clipboards and record requests. Years of case files were pulled from dusty cabinets and computer databases. Patterns began to leap off the page, undeniable and shocking. The numbers told one story, but the people told another. Defendants who had walked out of that very courtroom years earlier came forward, their voices now louder than fear. A mother recounted being fined $500 for contesting a zoning issue, even though she had clear proof the city was wrong. A young man remembered how the judge mocked him openly, questioning his character, while treating another defendant with kindness only minutes later. Each story was a thread, and together they wove a damning picture. And the story did not stay contained in Greenville. The young law student's social media post, describing Kendrick's confrontation with the judge, spread far beyond her circle of friends. Within days, local activists shared it, then regional journalists, and soon it reached national platforms. Headlines appeared: Federal Prosecutor challenges biased judge in Greenville, and courtroom inequality exposed. Television anchors debated the case during primetime news slots. Kendrick's phone buzzed constantly, calls from reporters, emails from people he had never met, letters arriving at his office with stories of courtroom bias from across the country. He answered few of them. He had no interest in fame. His focus stayed on the investigation. Meanwhile, the courthouse itself became the center of attention. Protesters gathered outside, holding handmade signs that read, "Justice should be blind and end bias now." Their chants echoed through the streets, carried by passion and anger. Some were longtime residents who had lived under the judge's shadow for decades. Others came from neighboring towns, standing in solidarity. Inside the building, tension ran high. Staff who had once moved quietly through their routines now looked over their shoulders. Mrs. Thompson, the clerk, who had once kept her notebook hidden, now spoke openly to investigators. Her notes were no longer a secret, they were evidence. Every time something didn't sit right, she explained, I wrote it down. I didn't know if anyone would ever listen, but now they are. James Wilson, the bailiff, also stepped into the spotlight. For 15 years he had stood by the judge's bench keeping order, watching silently. Now he spoke with conviction. I've seen the difference. How one person is scolded while another walks free. I always knew it wasn't right. It's long past time someone did something. His words carried weight, not only because of his role, but because they came from a man who had seen it all up close. Judge Whitman, once untouchable, now found himself cornered. Rumors spread of closed-door meetings with oversight committees. Official statements from his office denied wrongdoing, but his tone wavered. At one point, he released a short public comment saying he regretted any unintentional harm caused by his rulings. The words fell flat. To the public, they sounded hollow against the mountain of evidence. By the end of the second week, the Judicial Review Commission released preliminary findings. The results were staggering. Over 5 years, black defendants in his courtroom had been fined 3 times more often than white defendants for the same infractions. Late arrivals by white defendants were overlooked, while black defendants faced harsh penalties. Even requests for payment plans showed bias, denied frequently to minorities, granted generously to others. The numbers were damning, but the real impact lay in the stories. Community members began sharing openly at town halls and rallies. Some spoke in trembling voices, others with fiery determination. This isn't just about one man, one speaker said to a packed crowd. This is about trust in the system. National outlets picked up those words and ran with them. Hashtags like the Equal Justice Now and Bias in the Courts trended for days. Thousands of people across the country shared their own courtroom experiences, many eerily similar to what Kendrick had witnessed. For Kendrick, it was overwhelming, but also clarifying. He hadn't wanted the spotlight, but he understood its power. The storm that had broken wasn't about him. It was about all those voices that had been ignored for too long. He stayed steady, working closely with investigators, turning over every record, every inconsistency. In private moments, though, he thought about that first morning. The judge's dismissive words, the gavel coming down, the silence that had filled the room. That humiliation had been real, but now it had become something more. A spark that lit a fire the system could no longer put out. The storm had broken wide open, and for the first time in years, people began to believe that real change might be possible. The commission released its final report on a clear Monday morning. The findings were not a surprise anymore, but seeing them in black and white still felt heavy. The pattern was real. The harm was real. The report did not use loud words. It used careful ones. Yet every line carried weight. The board recommended action, training, audits, public reporting, oversight that had teeth. By noon, the courthouse issued a statement. The judge had resigned. A temporary presiding judge would step in while the state searched for a permanent replacement. Some people cheered. Others stood quiet, absorbing what this meant. For Kendrick, it was not a victory lap. It was a door opening to the work that had to follow. Change began in small ways first. Signs went up in the lobby that explained rights in plain language. Payment plan forms were printed in multiple languages. A staffed desk appeared near the entrance to guide people who felt lost. The old beige walls got a fresh coat of paint. It was not just decoration. It was a signal. This place would not hide in dull colors anymore. Inside the courtroom, the tone shifted. The new judge called people by name, listened, asked questions before deciding. It did not make every outcome easy. It made the process feel human. People left disappointed at times, but they left feeling seen. That mattered. The clerk, Mrs. Thompson, moved into a new role. She became the Ethics and Procedures Coordinator. She trained clerks across the county on how to document concerns and escalate them safely. She kept her small notebook, not as a secret now, but as a lesson. She would hold it up in training and say, "This kept me honest when I was scared. You will not have to hide like I did." The bailiff, James Wilson, started leading sessions for court officers. He talked about posture, tone, and the power of small choices. How standing 2 steps back gives people space. How a calm voice can lower the heat in a room. He told new hires, "Our job is not only order. Our job is dignity. If you see something wrong, you speak." The young law student who wrote the first post turned her energy into action. With 2 classmates and a local nonprofit, she opened a small evening clinic. They helped people read summons, set up payment plans, and organize documents. They showed up on court days to sit in the back and take notes. Not to shame anyone, to remind the room that the public was watching. Sunlight is not loud, it is steady. That line became a motto at the clinic. Numbers began to tell a new story. Fines were more consistent. Requests for payment plans were judged fairly. Late arrivals were handled with one rule for all. The data went on the county website every quarter, and the press printed it without drama. Just the facts. The facts looked better each time. Away from the courthouse, life kept going. Kendrick still handled hard federal cases. Human trafficking, corruption, the kind of work that steals sleep but gives purpose. On a quiet Saturday, he drove to his grandmother's house. The tax office had corrected the assessment. The numbers finally made sense. He stood on the porch and thought about the little boy he once was. The boy who learned right and wrong in this very house. A neighbor waved from across the street. He waved back and breathed easier. He framed the receipt from that first fine and hung it by his desk. Not as a trophy. As a reminder. He told colleagues who asked about it, "That slip started a fight I did not plan to have, but I'm glad I did. It keeps me honest on slow days." Invitations came in to speak. Law schools, community centers, bar associations. Kendrick did not enjoy the spotlight, but he said yes when it helped the work. He told the same story each time with care. A simple morning, a small case, a choice to speak. He did not paint himself as a hero. He talked about people who stood up with him. The clerk, the bailiff, the students, the neighbors who showed up with signs and steady voices. One evening, he spoke at a town forum in a school gym. Folding chairs filled the floor. A father stood and thanked him for making the court a place he could explain to his children without shame. A woman shared that she had come to court shaking, but left feeling heard. The room clapped, not for Kendrick alone, but for the idea that things could be better and actually were. Not everyone loved the changes. A few voices said the new rules tied judges' hands. A few wrote letters saying the media made it worse. That is part of change too. You listen. You answer with facts. You keep going. Months later, the state opened a small judicial ethics center attached to the courthouse. It was not grand. A few rooms, a training hall, and a public reading area with case summaries written in plain English. The plaque by the door read, "Equal justice is everyone's right." The words looked familiar. They echoed what people had been saying on sidewalks and in meetings for months. At the opening event, Kendrick stood at the back for a while and watched people file in. Some he knew. Many he did not. The new judge greeted visitors at the door. Mrs. Thompson led a tour for clerks from 2 towns over. The law student pointed to a bulletin board listing free legal clinics. The bailiff adjusted chairs and smiled when he thought no one was looking. When it was his turn to speak, Kendrick kept it short. He talked about the morning that changed his life, about rules and how rules must serve people, about the courage it takes to raise a hand and ask a hard question in a quiet room. He looked at the rows of faces and said, "Justice is not automatic. It is a practice. It lives in what we do when no one is watching and when everyone is watching. You prove that here." After the event, he stepped outside into clean light. The building looked almost new. Fresh paint, clear signs, a line of people at the information desk instead of a crowd wandering in circles. He felt a steady calm. Not triumph, not relief. Something firmer. The feeling you get when a promise finally keeps. On his way to the car, an older man stopped him. The same man who had once glanced back in the courtroom when the fine fell like a hammer. He shook Kendrick's hand and said, "I used to come here afraid. Now I come here prepared. That will help my son and my grandson. Thank you." Kendrick nodded and said, "Keep holding us to it." He slid into the driver's seat and looked at the courthouse one last time. He thought of the clock that had read 8:42 on that first day. He thought of the gavel, the silence, and the choice he made to speak with calm words in a room that did not want to hear them. He turned the key and smiled, not because the story was done, but because it had landed in the right place. The road ahead was long. There would be other mornings, other rooms, other choices. But in Greenville, in that once tired courthouse, something real had shifted. People could feel it in the way voices carried without fear, They could see it in the way lines moved with order and care. They could measure it in charts that no longer told a story of imbalance. A simple case about a house had grown into a lesson for a city. A judge's power had met a community's will, and dignity, once bruised, now stood up straight. The work would continue. The promise would hold, and justice, practiced daily, would keep learning how to be fair.